back to Boston.
Okay.
Okay. So you said that's really where things started for you. So you moved there when you were 13. And so what did you get involved in? First of all, like what kind of kid were you in school?
Barely paid attention. I was, if ADD is real, I certainly had it. And I was very, very interested in what I was interested in. I was very uninterested in people telling me what to do. And I essentially couldn't wait to get out of school. But I would excel at things that I had interest in. And initially it was art. I wanted to be a comic book illustrator until I really got into martial arts. And martial arts became the focus of my life. Around 14, 15 years old, that's when I really became massively obsessed. And that was really the first thing that I ever did where I really didn't feel like a loser. Like I really felt like, oh, I actually have some talent. I actually can be exceptional. There's like something, because I grew up constantly moving, didn't really have a lot of friends. I would be new in this town. I'd get picked on. I wasn't a big kid. And there was a lot of issues with that psychologically. And I didn't like being afraid of other kids. I didn't like not knowing what to do if I ran into kids. They were going to bully me and pick on me. So I learned how to fight.
That's an annoying thing not to know what to do about.
Yeah. And, martial arts changed that 180 degrees. And then I became someone who I would be afraid of. I became the opposite of what I was. So what I was someone who was terrified of conflict, didn't know what to do. And what I became was, a Taekwondo champion. I became a martial arts champion. I knew how to fight.
So
I had done it so many times.
What did you do? You just walked into a joint one day and decided that that's what you were going to do? Like, how did it come about?
It was very fortunate. Well, I'd done a little bit of martial arts training at a different place. And then one day I was in Boston for a Red Sox game at Fenway Park. And as I was walking home to the train station with a friend of mine, there was a lot of people that were leaving the baseball game. So the lines from the train for the T, which in Boston, public transportation was very long. So we decided to go check out the Jae-Hun Kim Taekwondo Institute. It was right there. And I had been really into martial arts because of what I said, the aforementioned insecurities. And so I went up the stairs, and as I was walking up the stairs, just fortuitously, a guy named John Lee was training. And John was a national Taekwondo champion who was in preparation for the World Cup, which was this huge event that he was taking, the international event that he was about to travel to go to. And he was in the peak of his training. And so I walked up to the top of the stairs, and I heard this crazy sound of this, what it turned out to be this man kicking this bag and slamming his heel into this bag and having the chain snap and rattle, and the thud of his heel slamming into this leather bag. And I got up there and I watched this guy work out. I couldn't believe a person could do that. I'd never seen anybody kick something so hard in real life, anybody that had such incredible martial arts skill like this guy did, John Lee, who became a mentor of mine and taught me quite a bit. But that changed everything. I was there the next day. I talked to them. They gave me a brochure and a pamphlet. And I was there the next day, and I was probably there every day of my life, give or take a few days here or there if I was injured or if something came up, until I was 22 years old.
So how many hours a day were you spending there?
All day. I had keys pretty quickly. They gave me keys. They wanted me, right away, my instructor recognized that I was pretty obsessed and I was physically pretty talented. So he had me teaching classes instead of paying. He was like, if it's difficult for you to pay, I'd like to have you teach. And there was some wisdom to that too, because one of the best ways for someone to get good at martial arts is actually to teach. You actually refines your technique. You think about it more. You're explaining it to people that don't necessarily understand all the mechanics of it. So I started teaching. I would teach private lessons to beginners. I would teach group classes. And then eventually I went on to teach at Boston University. I taught at Boston University when I was 19. I was teaching a accredited class there. But it counted towards your GPA. And so I did that. I was already U.S. Open champion by then. And
How long did it take? So you went in there when you were 13, and you were a kid that had moved around a bunch and got pushed.
I was 14 or 15 by the time I got to that school.
Okay.
And then I had my black belt by the time I was 17, and I was competing in the adult division by then. Before I was ever 18, I was competing as an adult. I mean, he might have even put me in when I was 16, if I remember correctly. And then I won the state championship when I was 18, and I won it every year from then until I stopped.
Right, so you had a pretty successful run at it there. How long did it take before? Like, were you a thin? Like, were you a skinny kid when you started? When did you start to bulk up and get big? When did you start to get tough enough so that the problems with aggression stopped? With other people's aggression stopped being a trouble for you.
Well, luckily with high school, kids heard about it right away. It was one of those things where you find out that there's one of the kids you go to school with is flying all over the country, kicking people in the head.
Right.
They just avoided me.
Yeah. Right.
I became. It wasn't like, I mean, I certainly never sought out trouble, but people avoided me. Like, junior and senior year, I'd already become this weird kid that was obsessed with martial arts. And I spent, most of my life from the time I was 15 till I was 21 training and competing. I probably fought over 100 times. I traveled all over the country. I fought in California. I fought in Ohio. I fought all over the place. And
right.
A lot of local tournaments in Connecticut and Massachusetts and New Hampshire is where I won the U.S. Open. And I've just fought everywhere. And that was most of my life. Yeah, that was most of my life until I got into stand-up comedy.
Right. So you had a very singular life. Like that's
100% singular.
Yeah.
Uniquely singular. But I avoided most of the pitfalls of high school partying and all that stuff. I didn't do that because I was scared of getting hurt. I was scared that if I showed up for training hungover, that I'd get beat up, and that it would somehow. I was scared of anything that would take even a tiny bit away from my performance as a fighter, because I was obsessed with it.
Was that scared of? Was that actually fear of being hurt because you made a mistake, or fear of losing the competition, or fear of
being hurt, fear of losing the competition, fear of being hurt in training? Training alone was as scary as any competition. I just completely by luck wandered into one of the best schools in the world for Taekwondo. They had produced multiple national champions and real top of the food chain athletes in terms of Taekwondo. And it was just dumb luck that I walked into that school. And, I could have walked into another school that was a few blocks away that was terrible. I mean, I just got lucky. I got really, really, really lucky.
So how useful are the technical martial arts like Taekwondo and like in an actual street fight?
Not that useful. I mean, more useful than knowing nothing, but not as useful as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Or now, a lot of people now are just learning mixed martial arts, which is essentially what you see in the UFC, where they're a jack of all trades, master of none. And the argument, there's two arguments. Like there's an argument that is a good thing to learn. And then there's other arguments that being a specialist first is the best thing. And then learning the other things later in life is the best way to go about it. Like a specialist, particularly a striker or a grappler, like being an elite wrestler or an elite jiu-jitsu artist, and then learning all the other stuff later in life, because you have such a significant advantage if you can bring the fight into your realm of expertise. So if you are a striker, every fight starts standing up. And if you're an elite striker and you know how to avoid takedowns and you know how to wrestle enough to keep a guy off you, you'll have such a significant advantage striking that you can dominate the competition. And we've seen that in the UFC. We've seen that with both grappling and with striking, that it seems that if you become a specialist in one particular area and then learn those other things, you'll be better off. But you can't really just be a specialist, whether it's in Muay Thai or Taekwondo or Jiu-Jitsu. You really kind of have to understand, if you're a grappler, you really kind of have to understand striking. And if you're a striker, you really kind of have to understand grappling in order to at least avoid it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So during this time too, I mean, you got to be a pretty big guy. So when did that start happening? Were you working out like mad while you were training as well?
Yeah, but I was much thinner. I was much thinner back then. I didn't do much weightlifting because I was trying to compete in certain weight classes. When I was 17, I was cutting weight when I was 17 and 18. I was trying to make the 140-pound weight class, but I was really probably about 10 pounds plus heavier than that. And I would dehydrate myself, and it was really affecting my performance. And then when I was 18, I moved up to the next weight class. That was 154, I believe it was. And when I moved up to that weight class, I got way better. That was when I really excelled. That's when I became like a real national class athlete, was when I moved up. And but I still wasn't lifting weights much. I was just doing Taekwondo training. It was just a lot of heavy bag work, some calisthenics, but mostly it was martial arts work. Then when I started getting into jiu-jitsu, it was long after I stopped competing. That's when I started really getting into weightlifting, because jiu-jitsu involves grappling, and I think the advantage to being strong in grappling is pretty significant.
Right,
it's gigantic. And so that's when, I was like 29 or so like that. That's when I really started heavily weightlifting and
okay, so
really
that was quite a bit later. How long did your initial martial arts career last?
I fought from the time I was 15, and I think I had my last fight. It was either I was 21 or 22. I don't really remember those, but the last 3 fights were kickboxing fights, and I had those while I was doing stand-up comedy. So I was spreading myself too thin. I was working a bunch of different jobs. I was working delivering newspapers. I was working as a private investigator's assistant. I did some construction. I did a bunch of different odd jobs to make a living. And I had decided somewhere along
newspaper, delivery boy, construction agent, jiu-jitsu fighter, stand-up comedian. That's kind of your typical 19-year-old situation.
Yeah, well, jiu-jitsu came later. Jiu-jitsu didn't come until I think I was 28 or 29 when I first started training jiu-jitsu. That was mostly just Taekwondo and kickboxing. I really got into kickboxing, and I had 3 kickboxing fights, and I was entertaining the idea of fighting professionally. But I was also starting to get really worried about brain damage. I started to see some signs.
From kickboxing specifically?
Yeah, specifically because I was getting hit a lot more.
Oh yeah.
The kickboxing sparring that I did that over the course of about 2 years, where I really got heavily into kickboxing. I did a lot of boxing sparring and a lot of what you would call gym wars, where guys we would beat the shit out of each other, and you'd get hurt and you'd come home with headaches, and you basically were fighting in the gym. I mean, it's not a wise way to do it. The smart gyms now and the best martial artists, they very rarely spar hard. Most of the time they spar technically. So they're hitting each other, but they hit each other like this. They don't blast each other full blast. They sort of touch each other. They're working on timing, and occasionally you go hard just to make sure that you can survive with these techniques in a firefight, that you know how to deal with it once you get hit. But we didn't.
Right, and is the lower combat intensity still useful for training for the real thing?
Yes, it's but you have to have some high intensity, and some people that high intensity, they actually have drills that they use to sort of to simulate actual exchanges that you would have. There's a lot of science to it now that didn't exist back then. The gyms that I came up in were real hard-nosed, really, tough gyms. And
right.
If you weren't tough, you did not survive. And they weren't interested in anybody that couldn't take a shot or anybody that wasn't willing to go to war. So you would put on a mouthpiece, you put on a cup, you put your shin pads on, and you beat the fuck out of each other. And that was a big part of learning how to fight. These sparring sessions were brutal. They were nerve-wracking. You'd be scared. You'd be scared going into them. They'd be, you'd be anxious the night before if I knew how to spar a particular guy the next day, because I knew it was dangerous. You basically were having fights all the time. So I'd have fights several days a week. You would fight. You know,
right.
It wasn't really sparring. You would hit it. I'd hit guys as hard as I could.
Covering a lot too, man, all the time.
Yeah.
I would think from that. So, okay,
yeah,
now you're just a big hole in this story too. So, like, you're doing great at Taekwondo. You go, you're national level athlete, and you switch to kickboxing. You're worried about getting hurt, and that seems reasonable because, like, how about not being brain damaged by the time you're 30? But then, you know, I guess kind of what I'm wondering was, like, how many shots in the head did you have to take before you thought being a stand-up comedian was a good idea?
Well, one of my dear friends to this day is a guy named Steve Graham. And Steve was, when I met him, I was 15 and he was probably 30. And he was going through his residency as an ophthalmologist. And he had been a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force. And just he had been on the U.S. ski team. He was a national skiing champion. Just a wild man, just a guy who took chances and lived life to the fullest, and was just one of the most hardworking people I ever met in my life. And I would make him laugh, and I would make some of the people laugh in training because we were always nervous. When we would go to tournaments, we were nervous because, you know, I'd seen many of my friends get knocked unconscious at these tournaments, get kicked in the head, taken to hospitals. And, you know, I'd seen it in the gym too. A lot of guys getting beat up and knocked out in the gym. It was constant. And, and it happened to me a couple of times. I'd been hurt. And so we had this gallows humor where we would go to these events. We'd travel to these tournaments and the tension would be so thick. Everybody would just taking deep breaths and trying to relax and just stay loose before you fight. And I would be the class clown in that environment. And
had you ever seen any of that when you were in high school or junior high? Like, would you ever play?
I didn't have that.
So it took those circumstances.
Yes, I did have a sense of humor, but it would manifest itself in cartoons. I would draw like cartoons of the teacher. You know, I would like draw cartoons of like certain kids that would kiss the teacher's ass. I would draw them like kissing the teacher's ass and saying ridiculous things. And if the teacher was late to a class and I knew I had enough time, I would put something on the chalkboard and then pull down the screen so that when they would go to use the chalkboard, they would pull the screen back up and see this ridiculous cartoon that I had drawn. The whole class would laugh, and then the teacher would ask, "Who did this?" And luckily nobody ratted me out. But so I enjoyed making people laugh, but that was it mostly wasn't things I said. It was mostly cartoons.
Right.
But
then that's very different. Yeah.
Yeah, but with comedy, with the fighting, when we were getting ready to compete, I was just trying to add some levity. I was just trying to lighten up the mood because everybody was, and it was a charged environment. So anything that I said that was actually funny would get a giant reaction, and that became addictive. And I was pretty good at doing impressions. So I'd do impressions of our friends, do impressions of our instructor, all these in ridiculous situations. And my friend Steve Graham and my other friend Ed Shorter, who's another one who encouraged me, who I lost touch with, unfortunately. He said, "You should be a comedian." And my take on it was, you think I'm funny because you're my friend, but other people are going to think I'm an asshole. Like, the things that I think are funny are fucked up.
Right.
Like, I have a fucked up sense of humor. I mean, here I am devoting most of my time to trying to get really good at knocking people unconscious. I mean, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to separate people from their consciousness. I was doing my best every day to get good at that. So it's
like a really perverse psychedelic drug.
Yeah, it was the worst. Yeah. But I was trying to hurt people. That's what I was trying to get good at. I was trying to get good at hurting human bodies. And I just I thought that I was such a weirdo and such an outlier in terms of like how society viewed combat, physical hand-to-hand combat and interactions with each other, that no one would think that the things that I was making fun of were funny. And this guy convinced me to go to an open mic night. He's like, "You should go to an open mic night. Just go. There's a lot of comedy clubs in Boston. Go and watch." And I went and watched, and I realized, wow, one of the things about going to open mic night is most open mic comedians are so terrible that it encourages you to try it, because you're like, well, I can't be that bad. Like, I might have something that's better than some of these people. And then, you'd see a real professional go up and it would be so discouraging, because you'd say like, God, my God, I'll never be that funny. That guy's impossibly funny. But I knew from martial arts that if I worked really hard at something, I could get good at it. And I had this thought that maybe I could do that with comedy, because I didn't want to fight anymore. I was already on my way kind of out the door. I was really worried about the brain damage. I was on my way out the door from the time I was like 19. From the time I was 19, I was starting to worry about brain damage. And then,
so you're 53?
I'm 51.
51. And so much, how much damage did you actually sustain? Like lots of people.
I don't know. I mean, I seem to be okay.
How about physically, muscularly, and that sort of thing?
Oh, no, I'm fine. I had a bunch of surgeries. Good. I've had my nose repaired. My nose was destroyed. I had no nose. Like, the inside of my nose just didn't work until I was 40. And then I had a deviated septum operation. They had to cut out giant calcified chunks of scar tissue and all sorts of, my nose was useless until I was 40 years old.
So that must have been kind of a relief to have your nose.
Oh my God. I tell everybody, get it done. If you have a deviated septum and you can't breathe out of your nose, my God, I couldn't do that until I was 40.
Yeah.
And it was just all I broke my nose, who knows how many times, at least a dozen. And it was always bloody. I was always getting punched or kicked in the nose.
Yeah, it doesn't seem designed as a sense organ to be in the middle of your face where you get punched.
Well, it has this little tiny piece of cartilage too.
It should be on the top of your head. Delicate. It'd be a lot safer up there.
Yeah,
like a whale.
Well, it also makes your eyes swell shut. It makes your eyes water. It makes it difficult to see when you get hit in the nose. Getting hit in the nose is really annoying. But other than that, I had both my knees reconstructed. I had ACL tears in both knees. I had to get them reconstructed, and a bunch of other stuff.
Oh yeah. So you took
a bunch of other broken things. Yeah, broken
yourself
shins
up pretty good.
Feet. Yeah, broken knuckles, and I broke a lot of stuff. But everything works great now. I mean, after surgery, and I mean, for a person who's been through what I do, what I've done with my body works remarkably well.
Yeah, it's amazing, actually. That's a lot.
Yeah.
You'd think you'd be arthritic, at least in some of your joints and that sort of thing.
No, I'm pretty good. I mean, I also am very proactive. I do a lot of yoga. I've had a bunch of stem cell therapies to deal with some significant tears and injuries that I've had. But all that, knock on wood, everything works pretty good. But the brain damage thing is, I don't know. I really don't know. I really sit back and think about some of those wars that I was in.
Yeah.
Gym wars in particular, and some fights. And my last fight, I got TKO'd. I got stopped. I got hit with a left hook and dropped. And my legs went out from under me. And then I got up and I got hit again, fell down again. They stopped the fight. And that was when I decided I'm going to stop. I was like, I'm not giving this the same amount of dedication I gave when I was at my best. I was spreading myself way too thin with comedy, and I just didn't have this same hunger for it that I had when I was young or younger. And I was also very aware of the consequences at that point in my life. I was like, I know where this is going. I saw guys at the gym that were punch drunk, that were slurring their words, and they would forget things. And I had seen some people progress towards that. And it was very, very disturbing to me. I'd be lying in bed at night after a hard sparring session. My head would be pounding. And I would think, what am I doing to my fucking brain? Like, what am I doing to myself? And I got real lucky that I found stand-up comedy. I mean, if the UFC was around back then, I most certainly would have started fighting. And, and to not be training intelligently, because I wasn't training intelligently. I was training like a meathead. And that was just all we knew back then. I probably would have sustained some pretty significant damage before I ever even got into the octagon. I probably would have already had massive brain damage before I ever had a fight.
Right.